I often do think of it in that sort of like almost like parasitic kind of way where it's like it's just gonna find like a suitable host, right? Like it's like it goes after what works.
Hello and welcome to OCD Behind the Scenes, a podcast brought to you by OCDMidwest.org, an affiliate of the International OCD Foundation. I'm your host, Marty McGovern, a practicing psychotherapist at Wellington Counseling Group in the Chicagoland area, and today we're speaking with Ben Eckstein, a therapist specializing in the treatment of OCD, anxiety, and OC-related disorders. Ben is the owner and director of Bull City Anxiety and OCD Treatment Center in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. In addition to his clinical work, Ben is a speaker, trainer, and the author of Worrying is Optional: Break the Cycle of Anxiety and Rumination That Keeps You Stuck. In today's conversation, we discuss invisible loops and the hidden world of mental compulsions, specifically the differences between awareness, attention, and engagement when it comes to the more internal side of OCD. Check out Ben's info in the description to see more of his work, and be sure to share your thoughts in the comments.
My name is Ben Eckstein. I am a therapist in North Carolina, and I am the owner and director of a practice that treats anxiety and OCD. It's called Bull City Anxiety and OCD Treatment Center. My first real foray into treating anxiety and OCD was at McLean Hospital at the OCD Institute there. So that is a residential treatment facility for folks with OCD. It was actually the first ever residential treatment for OCD in the country. My job prior to that had been in inpatient psychiatry. I was working at a public hospital in Brooklyn on an inpatient unit, and it was really hard. I think it was in a really tough neighborhood, and a lot of the folks coming in just had a lot of really giant systemic issues that they were up against, and it felt like kind of a revolving door, and it just felt like I wasn't making much of a difference, and it was kind of demoralizing. And then I always think about that juxtaposition to like kind of go from this position where it just felt like I couldn't get any traction to a place where it was just life-saving treatment, right? Like people are coming in not having left their homes in decades, and they're emerging from this treatment program having a new lease on life. And it just felt so good to find a treatment that really, really worked. And yeah, I just kind of knew I didn't want to do anything else after that. And I indeed have been doing it ever since. And yeah, I love it. It feels really good.
That's incredible, especially with people who haven't left their house in decades. The topic we're going to be digging into is invisible loops. And I'm curious, when people think of OCD, they often imagine visible rituals like hand washing and things like that. So could you tell us a little bit about what invisible loops are or mental compulsions are?
Yeah. I think you're spot on. That I think most people are more familiar with these really tangible things, some of the sort of classic OCD symptoms, things like hand washing or checking blocks, stoves, that kind of thing. Um, and obviously those things are a big part of OCD, but I think people miss that there's a really big part of this that is just happening inside people's heads. And I know as I find myself doing a lot of consultation and training with therapists who are sort of newer to doing exposure and response prevention, which is sort of the gold standard treatment for OCD. I People often end up in this place saying, "Hey, we're doing ERP," and people are just not, they're not getting better. It's not working. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's because people are missing these more subtle kind of variations of compulsions, right? They're eliminating the really tangible stuff, but they're missing these other more subtle things. And so I think that's what I think has gotten me more interested in it, is it seems like it's just a really common pitfall for people who are trying to do this treatment, is that they're missing this other part of it. Um, so mental compulsions, just like a tangible compulsion. So I think we really just define this by its function. So I think people can get kind of stuck on the content. Oh, you're doing something repetitively, it's excessive, you're doing a lot of it. And really what we're more interested in is the function. So is this behavior meant to prevent or reduce distress? That's how we think about compulsions. And so, yes, we can do things like hand washing or checking a stove to prevent or reduce distress. But we can also do a lot of stuff in our heads, and that might be trying to push a thought away. It might be trying to think a good thought to balance out a thought. It can even be subtle things like just kind of hypervigilance, hyper-awareness, paying a lot of attention. I think about something like contamination, for example, where people often think about hand washing and cleaning. Um, but I think one of the most exhausting things that folks with contamination often struggle with is just this constant tracking of what has touched what, right? So they are not in the moment. They are in their heads paying attention to, oh, that person came inside and they touched their shoe when they came in, and now they touched the counter and then they touched the door to the refrigerator. And it's like that constant tracking, that's a compulsion too. So again, some of this happens more automatically. But then there is some point where it becomes this more volitional, intentional behavior that people are doing. So yeah, there's a lot of this really subtle stuff that just happens in people's minds. And if we're only focused on that external, tangible compulsion, we're going to miss out on a lot of stuff. And ultimately, treatment won't be quite as effective.
And so when you think about those more subtle pieces, you mentioned that, ERP isn't working, what's going on? And then we find these subtle aspects of OCD to hone in on. Do you then come back around with the ERP, or do you bring in other tools? What are your approaches to that?
Yeah, so I mean, for sure, I think that we can still do ERP when people are doing mental compulsions. And so I think we have the same idea. So, with ERP, for anyone unfamiliar, this is the idea that the exposure part is we are intentionally confronting these kind of feared stimuli, things that evoke anxiety. And then we're using this as an opportunity to practice resisting the compulsions that come along with it. And this then becomes a more effective learning opportunity. We can see that we're able to tolerate uncertainty, we're able to manage distress, we're most likely these feared outcomes are not going to happen, or they're less likely to happen than we expected. And so it's really just this learning opportunity. And we know that when people are doing compulsions, they're just kind of confounding that learning. So if I go touch that, I don't know, that dirty garbage can, and then I go wash my hands, all that's happening is I'm learning I'm safe, not because the garbage can wasn't dangerous, but I'm safe only because I washed my hands. And so we can do the exact same thing with mental compulsion. So, if we use the contamination example that I just used, we can intentionally invite that person over to go about their business in the home and touch all the things. And our job is going to be to kind of let it happen, that we will notice what we notice, but we're not going to intentionally track this. And it might be that we are going to intentionally put our attention somewhere else, or we're going to remain really present and focused on the conversation that we're having. But I think our goal there is just to say, hey, I see these mental behaviors that I'm doing. And just like when we approach exposure in general, we're going to intentionally evoke these distressing situations, and then we're going to practice eliminating those mental compulsions. And I think the elimination of mental compulsions is tricky. I think this is probably one of the reasons why people struggle with this part of it, is like figuring out how not to engage in a mental behavior. It's a little tricky. There's some nuance there. But yes, I think we would approach it the same as we would ERP in general.
Absolutely. And I'd love to dig into that, because
Yeah.
it is such an interesting thing, because someone might think even just noticing it is engaging with it, but what are the nuances in there?
Yeah, for sure. Well, and so I think the thing that the place where I think it gets really tricky is we know what happens if we try not to have a thought, right? That doesn't work very well. And so when we're saying, hey, don't do mental compulsions, we're not saying try to do thought suppression. We're not saying try to prevent these thoughts from happening. But we are saying, like, hey, let's figure out where that point of control is. And so what the distinction I'm always trying to make is, so we have the process of having a thought, and then we have thinking, right? And those are two different things. They sound similar, but they're different. So having a thought just kind of happens to us. This happens all the time with OCD. There are intrusive thoughts, even outside of OCD. There are just thoughts showing up in our heads. They're not intentional. They're not things that we're trying to do. This is just something that our brains do. It's a function of our brains. A thought shows up in our minds. And that we don't control. We're not trying to stop that process. We know our brains are just going to go ahead and do this, whether we like it or not. It's just going to happen. But that's very different than this more intentional process where we're now noticing that thought and examining it or analyzing it or trying to do something with it. So there's having a thought, and then there's this response that we have to it. And so I think for a lot of people getting into that place where we're now able to resist a mental compulsion, it often means slowing things down a lot, building this awareness of that process, and starting to notice that point where we start to have control. And it's not perfect, that I don't know anyone who has this perfect control over where their focus and attention goes. But that's what we're trying to get to. And so I sometimes will make this kind of distinction. I always think about kind of awareness and attention and then engagement. And so I think awareness is one of these things that we don't control. I am aware of a gazillion different things right now, right? So my brain is taking in tons of this sensory information. I might be noticing how my chair feels, or the sound of my voice, or the sound coming from outside, or maybe I'm tired or hungry, or there's a lot of stuff happening. And our brains cannot possibly compute all of that. Like that, we don't have the processing power. And so this is why we have this nifty thing called attention and focus, right? Like that we take this giant floodlight that's noticing everything and we reduce it into a spotlight so we can focus on what's relevant, what's important. And that process of narrowing down awareness into attention, I think there's a lot of nuance there because that's one of these things that is partly automatic, but then we partly have control over it. So our brains will focus on lots of different things. Sometimes it's not the most relevant or important things. We can get distracted. We can start paying attention to things that feel scary, even if they're not really scary. So our attention can get commandeered, but we also have this ability to put it where we want it. And it's kind of a muscle that we have to build and practice, but it is something that can be done. And so I think this is what we're trying to do with some of these mental processes is we're trying to notice, okay, this thought popped up in my head, unbidden, unwanted sometimes. In that moment, I notice the thought. And I can choose what I do in that moment where I notice the thought. And I can choose to inspect it and engage with it. I can choose to try to figure something out, to try to get certainty. There's lots of stuff I can do with it. Or I can notice it, acknowledge it, say, thank you, brain, for that thought. I'm going to get back to the podcast that I'm doing right now. And I can refocus my attention in that moment. And so I think that kind of focusing attention, I think of as sort of similar to something like mindfulness, where we don't just choose to be mindful and then we're mindful forevermore. It's sort of a thing that we notice that moment where we're not being mindful and we bring ourselves back to a place where we're more present and grounded. And so I think a similar thing is true of attention, where yes, like we're going to get pulled all over the place. Just choosing to focus on the podcast doesn't mean it will forever be so, but it's a thing that I can keep doing if I notice my brain getting pulled away to something else.
I love that. And you mentioned something there about trying to figure it out and get certainty, which, as I think about these more, subtle, invisible kind of things, that really can become a big piece of it. And so I was wondering if you could give a few examples of what that, trying to get certainty might look like when someone is having these mental loops.
Yeah. Uh, so I think I think there's this tricky thing, and I will make a distinction here, which I'll acknowledge is not mine. So John Hirschfield wrote a book about intrusive thoughts, and he makes a distinction between confidence and certainty, and this idea that we kind of we kind of confuse those two things. And so I think I'm going to steal his example verbatim, but like I think I'm pretty sure the example he uses in his book is, hey, like if I'm sitting in my chair right now. I am not certain that my chair isn't going to just collapse and I'm just going to fall down, but I'm pretty confident that's not going to happen, right? So like confidence is this feeling that we have. Like I have a feeling of confidence of like, hey, I think this is the most likely outcome is that my chair will be able to hold me and I'll get through the podcast without falling down and it'll be all right. But I don't actually have certainty, right? Like certainty, by definition, we're saying like I need to know the future in order to have certainty, and I just don't have that ability. And so I think a lot of times we're trying to get this answer about often the future, sometimes the past as well. I need to be certain that I turned off the stove or that I didn't say something dumb when I hung out with my friends yesterday, right? Like, but we're trying to nail this thing down that we just can't really know. I often do, and I always want to be careful not to veer too far into reassuring people or like I don't want to participate in a compulsion, but I do think there's something useful about kind of picking apart these questions sometimes and just asking ourselves the question of, hey, like, is this actually something that I can know definitively? If I'm trying to solve a math problem, that's something that I can know. There's a correct answer. If I ask 100 people, they're all gonna, if they know how to do math, like they're all gonna come up with the same answer, right? Like there is an answer that we can find. But if I'm asking, I don't know, who's gonna win the Yankee game tonight? After tonight, there will be an answer. But right now, I don't have access to that. I don't know the future. And I can make guesses. I can say, oh, well, their best player is injured. They're probably going to lose. Or they haven't been very good this week. So they're like, I can make some guesses and I can kind of hypothesize. But I think we have to be able to make that distinction between, hey, here's a problem with a definitive answer that I can know right now. And here's another problem where the closest I can get is speculation. And I'm sure we can call up Vegas and say, hey, what are the odds on the Yankee game tonight? But that's as close as it gets, right? Like it's a guess. And so I think if we find ourselves in that place where all we can do is make a guess, we kind of have to accept some uncertainty, right? Like that, I think we then have to pivot to a place where we're saying, hey, I have to allow for some degree of not knowing. And I think that can be uncomfortable. It can be really painful. But I think we want to be careful that we don't get sucked into this process, a compulsive process of trying to find certainty in these places where it just cannot possibly exist.
Yeah, and I think with OCD, it's a really interesting one because it can go into these realms of identity that are um, very kind of, big ideas that people really want to lock down, or fears around maybe harming people, or different things that might come up that sort of reflect internally as shame or different emotions like that. And I'm curious, what are some of the maybe lesser known ways that this can show up?
Yeah. And I think that that fear of, hey, this uncertainty is intolerable. So like it's okay. All right, we don't know who's going to win the Yankee game. Who cares about it, right? It doesn't matter. But if what's on the line is, am I a good person? Am I going to harm my loved ones? Right? Like that feels a little more significant. Um, the thing that I would point out though is that I think that content is a little misleading. And I think this is one of the ways that OCD kind of baits people and gets them to engage with this stuff because there's this kind of fear mongering of like, oh no, but these things are really meaningful. And so I would say, so I'm going to go back to the Yankee game thing. So like, but we don't get to know who's going to win the Yankee game. And I think it's tempting to say, oh, but I have $1 million riding on the Yankee game. That's really significant. And I would say, like, okay, great. But like, if you have $1 million on the game or $1 on the game, it does not change the fact that we don't get to know the outcome of the game. And so I think that that's the significance of it, how meaningful it is. I get that, hey, this is why it's tormenting and it's upsetting. And like, of course, like I don't have $1 million to lose, but if I did, I would be much more upset if I lost it than I would a dollar. So like, yeah, I get it. Like there's something to the stakes there that feels really meaningful, but it doesn't change the nature of this dilemma, which is we don't actually get to know. And so I think this is often a thing that I find myself coming back to with OCD is, I know the content is such a big part of the experience for people going through it. And yet it's such a distraction from this process that is actually the thing that's getting people into trouble, right? So it's not about the fear that people have, it's about how they're relating to that fear and the space that it's starting to take up in their lives and the way that it's becoming impairing, right? Like it's about that relationship to it more than it is the thing itself.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to put it. And when it comes to the work that you've done, I know you wrote a book called Worrying is Optional. How does that tie into these invisible loops and compulsions?
Yeah. So, I'll say I think the title uh it's kind of catchy and it gets people curious and I'm sure the publisher loves that. But what I'll say, what I like more than the title is actually the little tagline that they came up with, which is uh, worry happens, worrying is optional. And so I really like that differentiation between worry, the noun, versus worrying, the verb, right? So this idea that, hey, these thoughts happen. We're going to have things that scare us. We're going to have, if we have things that we care about in our lives, we are going to be concerned that we might lose those things, and there's a lot at stake. I think worry is part of life. If you have stuff you care about, you're going to be worried that you're going to lose it, right? Like that makes sense. But that's different than the process, the verb of worrying and making that choice to inspect and analyze and pick apart all of these things, spending time trying to solve unsolvable problems, right? Like that's a different thing. And I think my only misgiving about the title is like, I don't mean to imply that that's an easy or simple thing to do. But I think that it is important to notice that we do have some agency here. And I think this is a thing that I hear a ton of, I think, with worrying, with doing mental compulsions, is that idea of like, well, this is just how it is. Like, this is how my brain works. This is how it's always going to be. I don't have any say in it. This is just how my brain does things. And I appreciate that our brains are all unique and different, and they have their own kind of tendencies. And there's some reality to that, of course, but I think it kind of implies that there is no agency. There's nothing we can do. We are just, I don't know, we'll have to throw up our hands and say, hey, this is how it is. And again, I think that's probably true for the initial thought that shows up, but it's not as true for that process of engaging with it. And so I think just like managing anxiety in general, I think it's fair to say, hey, some people are prone to being more anxious. That's true. That's accurate. But then you have that choice of saying like, well, if I'm someone who's prone to getting more anxious, it would probably behoove me to get really good at being anxious and to like figure out a more adaptive relationship to that experience. And so I think the same thing is true of worry and worrying, that I think if you're someone prone to worrying, like that's probably a skill you're going to want to get pretty good at.
Yeah, and it kind of brings up this idea that I've heard in the past, which is OCD is kind of a doubting disease, where, let's say someone has relationship OCD and they're just constantly doubting, is this the right person? Is this the right thing? Am I blah, 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 blah. And it can go in these spirals, and this can definitely be one of those mental compulsions that you're speaking towards. And so there's the doubt. But then there's the checking on the doubt, or there's the researching, or there's the going down a YouTube rabbit hole, or, how have you sort of seen it show up in those types of contexts?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that name is pretty apt. And I think there's a lot of doubt wrapped up in OCD, that questioning of everything. And I think one of the things I think is interesting is like, again, I think that content is just the first layer of it. And so I think, if someone has doubt of, hey, did I turn off the stove, for example, and they go check the stove, they see the stove is off. It can seem like, okay, I had doubt about the stove and I checked the stove. But I know when you check that stove the second time, the third time, the fourth time, we're not really checking the stove anymore. So like that second time, it's, did I remember that correctly? Can I trust my own perception? Maybe when I went to turn it off, I actually turned it back on, right? Like that it moves from I'm checking the stove to I'm checking myself, right? Like I've lost that ability to trust in my own sense of things, to trust the reality that I'm seeing right in front of me. And so like I think that's one of the more insidious parts of it, that it's not just the stove, it's this broader, more pervasive thing where now we're doubting ourselves and our capabilities. And I think that's where I see it really getting in the way, where it starts to erode just that trust in ourselves.
Yeah, I think the way that you said that, can I trust my own perception? And this sort of brings us to what you were speaking about earlier, which is the emotional toll that these invisible compulsions can have. What are some of the emotional kind of exhaustion? Like what happens when these continue to build and people start to get exhausted? How do they tend to show up in your practice?
Yeah. Well, I think you've nailed that with the exhaustion thing, right? Like that I think, there's no better or worse version of OCD. It's not a competition around like, yeah, what's most disruptive. But, I think when you have things like tangible compulsions, it's people can see the time it's taking, the impact that it has. If you've spent 3 hours in the shower, you spent all day trying to do the dishes, right? Like people can see that toll that it takes. And I think the unseen toll of mental compulsions, I think it's really painful, right? Like this is a thing that can consume a huge chunk of people's lives, and it can happen anywhere, anytime. If we think about, I don't know, I have an obsession around dirt or germs. We might be able to say like, okay, well, like maybe there are certain things that are triggering certain situations. When we're talking about mental compulsions, right? Like this can show up anywhere, right? Like there's no limit to the places where it can be. And so yeah, I think it is exhausting. And I think that, you know, ends up having this trickle down effect where, I think people are worn down. When you're worn down, you're even less able to resist some of those compulsions. It can become this kind of self-perpetuating cycle. We see this a lot when you have kind of like sleep disruption, where it's like, all right, I didn't get enough sleep, and now my anxiety is worse, and I have even fewer reserves to try to resist and manage that anxiety, and now I'm getting even worse sleep, and right, like it just kind of spirals. And I think we see a similar thing with mental compulsions, where it's taking all this time, and then it's leaving you in this kind of compromised position. Um, and I feel like I also see it showing up a lot just in terms of avoidance. So if we're saying, hey, going to have this experience means that I'm going to have to contend with my thoughts the whole time, a lot of people will say, well, maybe I don't want to go have that experience. Maybe I don't want to go do that thing. And so I think it becomes pretty tempting to opt out, to avoid the triggering things just because you don't want to have to deal with it. So yeah, I think there is a really large sort of unseen toll that mental compulsions can take.
Yeah, I like that you brought up the opting out and avoiding piece. Because, someone might think, well, if I just avoid the thing that's causing all the thoughts and whatnot, then it'll go away or I won't have to deal with it. But one of the things that we also notice is that it can kind of shift to other things. And I'm curious, how have you seen mental compulsions maybe like, I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but like jump to other topics or change over time? What have you seen with that?
Yeah. Well, I think this is just kind of the nature of OCD, and everyone's different there, but I think there are some people where there's this constant whack-a-mole of different obsessions. And then there are other people who have the exact same obsession their entire lives, right? Like that. So like everyone's different. I always think of OCD as just sort of being opportunistic. That I always have mixed feelings about personifying it, but I often do think of it in that sort of like almost like parasitic kind of way where it's like it's just gonna find like a suitable host, right? Like it's whatever whether that's your, I don't know, like your some feared version of yourself or the things you really care about. People often say it kind of goes after your values. And I think those things can all be true. I just say like it goes after what works. Here's another anecdote that I actually don't remember who I stole it from, but it was not original, but I stole it from someone. I don't remember who, but I always think of it as kind of like, I don't know, if Marty, you came into my office and said like, oh, like Ben, if you don't give me $5, I'm gonna, I don't know, smash the little pot in the background there. I'd probably say like, well, I don't know, Marty, you seemed like a pretty nice guy, but like, I don't know, maybe I got the wrong idea about you. I don't know. And if I say like, okay, fine, here's $5, don't smash the plant. And if you come in the next day and now it's like, all right, if you don't give me $5, I'm gonna smash, I don't know, your phone or your computer or right, like, and I think this is just kind of what OCD does, right? Like it keeps upping the ante. And if at some point I say, you know what, Marty, go ahead, smash the plan. I don't care, do whatever. It's just going to move on to something else, right? And so like if I think for a lot of people in these moments where they push back, they say, okay, I'm not doing the compulsions anymore. OCD is not going to push me around. I'm resisting the compulsions. OCD will usually say like, okay, great. But what about this? How about this thing over here? Like, will that work? And so yeah, I think it's opportunistic. It's just trying to find something that sticks, something that grabs you. And yeah, I think when one version of the bait stops working, it just uses different bait. It moves from whatever worms to snails or whatever. Like it just
Yeah.
changes. Um, so yeah, I think it's frustrating. And then of course, as we have talked about, I think mental compulsions show up, there is no one OCD subtype that people talk a lot about pure O, this like purely obsessional version of OCD. Um, but I think the reality is like mental compulsions happen with every single subtype. It's so if it just pivots to one thing, there will probably be mental compulsions that come with that as well.
Yeah, and we've talked a lot about the inner experience of the person dealing with it. And I also think it's really interesting to talk about how these, invisible loops can affect the people around that person and how they can kind of get drawn into the process of, you know, reassurance or enabling or different things like that. How have you seen um, this type of kind of hidden OCD affecting people around the person dealing with it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting question, right? 'Cause, like I think we know I think family accommodation, whether I don't know, parents, spouses, friends, whoever, right? That accommodating of OCD is a really common feature of OCD. It's the norm rather than the exception. This is, I think how most people try to support someone who's in distress is they try to make it go away, right? Like that makes sense. I don't fault anyone for doing that. I think that it's usually done with compassion and a desire to have your loved one not suffer. And so yeah, I get it. I and we also know it just ends up feeding the OCD cycle in the same way that a compulsion does. And so if that's doing a compulsion along with someone or just enabling that kind of compulsive behavior. It can happen in lots of ways, but yeah, it's all part of the same cycle that just perpetuates this problem. I think with mental compulsions, I think it depends, so I think there are a lot of people where the people around them have no idea what they're doing, right? Like that they're in their heads. Maybe it looks like they're distracted, they're not paying full attention, they're not fully present. And I think depending on I don't know how good that person with OCD is at hiding these things, and maybe depending on how perceptive their loved ones are, yeah, it sometimes does go unnoticed. I I think though there is something lost there, and I think we as you noted, we often focus on this internal experience of the person with OCD, and so for them to be in their heads while the world is happening around them we usually focus on how they're missing out on this experience. They're not present. They're not able to just kind of enjoy these things, and instead they're stuck in their heads doing all this other stuff. And I would also add, that I think that's probably true for the people around them as well, right? Like that their loved ones are missing out on that fully present version of their loved one. And whether they know it or not, there is something lost there. And so I think there are places where accommodation shows up with mental compulsions, and I think it depends on how those mental compulsions are showing up. But I think one that I see a lot is, I think for folks who have a mental compulsion that involves needing to do something in kind of a just right kind of way. So I need to think the right thought in order to do this, or yeah, I need to count to a certain number or get to a certain thing, or right like that. It can start to be pretty time consuming, and so I think that does tend to look a little bit different than just kind of like that more like something we think of as more like worrying, right? There's this more ongoing analysis, you can kind of pick it up and put it down. You can usually keep moving pretty fluidly while worrying about stuff. But I think when you get into that, like, oh, I need to do this just right, I often see family members who end up waiting on the person with OCD. We can't leave to go to school until you're done doing this mental compulsion. And so I think with things like that, I do tend to see more accommodation and kind of enabling, and it starts to be more disruptive to the family routines. So yeah, I think it really just kind of depends on how it's showing up for people, and yeah, the degree to which it does start to yeah, I don't know, like put wrinkles into the kind of norms of the family and what people are doing. Um, yeah,
Yeah, and I think that kind of comes back to that parasitic nature of it, where it's kind of sucking away time, sucking away energy, and just kind of leaving people depleted at the end of it.
yeah,
Um, are there any misconceptions that you have heard that you just kind of wish anyone listening would be able to dispel or see from a different perspective?
yeah, yes. So, I mean, I think well, I have a couple that come to mind. So I think the first one I touched on a minute ago. So pure O is is a good way to ruffle the feathers of OCD therapists, which is, I think it's a really important label. So for anyone unfamiliar, this stands for purely obsessional OCD. And most OCD therapists will tell you pretty quickly, oh, this is a misnomer, right? So it's what we're really saying is there is an obsession and you're doing mental compulsions. So it's not we still want to draw that line between obsession and compulsion. So there might be an initial thought that shows up, but then you are doing this mental process afterwards. So it's not purely obsessional. It might be purely in your head. It might be a purely mental activity, but there is still this line between obsession and compulsion. So I think that's a really important one. And again, I take no exception to the label. I think that can be really validating for a lot of people. I am all for people finding something that helps them to feel understood and finding their community. I think there's a lot of good stuff that comes with it. And the reason I push back on it a little bit is just because I think with that label, so the downside of it is that I think it can contribute to this belief that this is a thing that I don't control. It just happens in the same way that we say, hey, obsessions just happen. You don't control that part of it. And so if we're saying, hey, I have purely obsessional OCD, it kind of points you in that direction of saying like, oh, well, I guess I just don't control it. It just happens. So I think that's just something we have to be mindful of. And I think in that vein, I think the other thing I'm thinking about is as a misconception is just, yeah, that idea of control, that I think I always kind of point out to people. Just because something is a habit does not mean that it's inevitable, right? Like that you are just destined to do it forever. So if I am in the habit of putting my left pant leg on first, that doesn't mean I can't put my right pant leg on first. It just means it will take some intentionality. I might need to build awareness of that habit. I might need some reminders. I might need some strategies, right? Like but it can be done. And so I think we have lots of habits. Some of them are mental habits. But that doesn't mean we're just doomed to walk that path forever. I think it means it's going to require some intentionality and deliberate action in order to reshape that habit.
Yeah, I like how a lot of what we're talking about here kind of comes back to attention and then intention in many
Yeah.
ways.
Yeah. Yep. I think that's spot on.
So if folks want to hear more about your work or get in touch with you, where can they go?
Yeah. A couple places. So our practice has a website. It's bullcityanxiety.com. We are on social media. It is at Bull City Anxiety on Instagram or what's Twitter X these days, Facebook, all the things. So yeah, Bull City Anxiety website and social media. And then a lot of the stuff we've talked about today, I talk about in one way or another in my book as well. So yeah, I think if that is appealing, that book is called Worrying is Optional, and you can find it on Amazon, or I'm sure my publisher would prefer. You can also get it through New Harbinger publications.
Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate everything that you shared with the community.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.